Hey everyone. I actually haven't been on my channel in a while, but I actually plan on being here a little more to be more consistent with content and uploading more videos. And what I wanted to do now is actually kind of dive a little deeper into Black history. And one of the questions I wanted to present to you guys was, how well do you know Black history? And by Black history, I mean Black American history, not dealing with Africa, but in America. So are you someone who, can explain about slavery, Jim Crow, segregation? What about, W.E.B. Du Bois versus Booker T. Washington and their ideologies and their stances on certain situations? Of course, famously, MLK and Malcolm X. Are you able to compare and contrast them? Even things such as, the first black person to run for president or attend an Ivy League school, or even things about famous poets, black poets, musicians, authors, things like that. And I want you to actually answer that question for yourself based on some of the things that I said or even things that I didn't mention. You can say, I think I know a little bit about Black history. I think I know a lot, or kind of in the middle, or I'm not really sure. And in terms of diving deeper into that history, I wanted to actually focus on some of the content that may not be familiar, or a lot of people may not be familiar with it. And once you look at this content, we want to kind of analyze it and pick it apart and use our critical thinking skills to add more, info to our repertoire and say, well, based off of what I've just learned, I think, I didn't know Black history as much as I thought I did, or I do, and this just kind of adds to it, but not as much. Or it may be, my concept of what I thought about Black history or what I knew about Black American history may not be what I thought it was. But either way, like I said, we're just going to dive deeper into Black history and kind of open up those things that many of us may not have been privy to growing up or even now. But since we have access to the internet and we have access to technology, we can actually pull out those things that we didn't before. The first thing we're going to look at is the United States Constitution. And some people may ask, well, why are we looking at the Constitution? Well, there's actually a section in there that deals with slavery or the slave trade. And some people may have known that it was in there and some people may not have. But just to kind of start there, we're going to do Article 1, Section 9. So the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808. But a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person. So what this is basically saying is that if any state will admit someone, it doesn't matter if they're migrating or being imported. If any person is going to be admitted into a state, that Congress will not prohibit that until the year 1808. So the Constitution was actually, ratified in 1787, or it began to be ratified in 1787. So that's about 20 years that Congress won't prohibit anybody being imported into the states. But what they can do is actually impose an importation tax not to exceed $10 per person. So, of course, starting off, you may not say, well, does that really have to do with slavery? I mean, it says importing. So that doesn't necessarily have to do with someone coming in as slaves, which, yes, that is the case. But we're going to kind of look at Congress's, interpretation of what this is. And they say that this sanction for the importation of slaves by the states for 20 years after the adoption of the Constitution, when considered with the section requiring escaped slaves to be returned to their masters, was held by Chief Justice, all right, to show conclusively that such persons and their descendants were not embraced within the term citizen as used in the Constitution. And it says, today, this ruling is interesting only as in historical curiosity. But long story short, I just wanted to say that even during, the United States is inception, we'll say 1776, but they really didn't consolidate power until the Constitution, what the colonies did. So what we have now is the Constitution, where it's saying that states can import people and Congress won't do anything about it for about 20 years. And what we're going to do next is actually look at some of those acts that were passed afterwards that had to deal with slave trade. And then we can kind of get a, understanding or direction of what Congress was trying to do when it put this clause or this section into the Constitution. All right, so now what we want to do is look at one of the slave trade acts that was enacted by Congress. And this was done March 22nd, 1794. So this was, about 5 to 7 years after the Constitution was ratified. And this act is dealing with, or says, an act to prohibit the carrying on the slave trade from the United States to any foreign place or country. So going back to the Constitution wasn't going to prohibit anyone from being imported into the United States. And what Congress said was that they wasn't going to interfere with it for about 20 years. But what they're kind of doing is going, I guess, a little backdoor into what they said when they're actually talking about, okay, we won't prohibit people from being imported, but what we're going to do is kind of limit the slave trade from the United States to any other country or place. So they kind of, made an act to say opposite of what they said before, but they're still keeping up, I guess, with their word of saying that we won't interfere with the prohibition or importation until 20 years later. So before we actually read this article or this act, a couple of things I want to point out. One is that usually if you'll see a line right here and words under the bottom, these are actually footnotes about the act, and they don't deal with the language of the act itself, but it's more of like footnotes or guide notes about the act. All right. And two is that a lot of these acts are pretty wordy. And what Congress does is that they use a lot of commas instead of periods. And, if you don't kind of keep up with it, it can be difficult to follow it. So what I like to do when I'm reading a lot of these acts is, I read the title and I think I understand what the title is talking about. And once I read the sections, I try to make sure that whatever I'm getting from the sections matches with the title of the act. So I'll know, okay, at least I think I'm going in the right direction. And if not, I kind of reread something or say maybe I have a different interpretation and kind of, redirect myself and everything like that. So this first section is kind of lengthy, but I'm going to read it and then kind of just go through it and explain what it's saying. This one is Chapter 11, an act to prohibit the carrying on the slave trade from the United States to any other foreign place or country. And Section 1 says, be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that no citizen or citizens of the United States or foreigner or any other person, then we scroll down, that any other person coming into or residing within the same shall for himself or any other person whatsoever, either as master, factor, or owner, build, fit, equip, load, or otherwise prepare any ship or vessel within any port or place of the said United States, nor shall cause any ship or vessel to sail from any port or place within the same, for the purpose of carrying on any trade or traffic in slaves or to any foreign country. All right, so we're going to just stop right there and then just kind of break this first section down to what it was talking about before we move on to the rest of it. So what this first section is saying that basically it doesn't matter if you're a citizen of the United States, one citizen, multiple citizens, if you are a foreigner or anyone else and you reside in the United States or you're here temporarily, you cannot build or fit any ship in any port of the United States for the purpose of dealing in slave traffic to any foreign country. So what they're doing is limiting the ships that are in America's ports or the United States' ports to actually go out to do slave trade to any other country. All right, so going to the next part. Or for the purpose of procuring from any foreign kingdom, place, or country the inhabitants of such kingdom, place, or country to be transported to any foreign country, port, or place, whatever, to be sold or disposed of as slaves. So now this is adding on to it. So it says that you can't build any ship or prepare any ship to deal with slavery from the United States to any other country. And you also can't build it to go somewhere else to get slaves and bring them back to the country if you started in the United States' port or any port owned by the United States. And if any ship or vessel shall be so fitted out as aforesaid for the said purposes, or shall be caused to sail so as foresaid, every such ship or vessel, her tackle, furniture, apparel, and other appurtenances shall be forfeited to the United States. So basically, if it's found out that you actually fit up your ship for these purposes, then your tackle, everything that's on that ship, shall be forfeited to the United States, and shall be liable to be seized, prosecuted, and condemned in any of the circuit courts or district court for the district where the said ship or vessel may be found and seized. So basically, they're going to take you to court if they find that you've actually violated this act. All right, section 2. And be it further enacted that all and every person, so building, fitting out, equipping, loading, or otherwise preparing or sending away any ship or vessel, knowing or intended that the same shall be employed in such trade or business, as in slave trade or business, contrary to the true intent and meaning of this act, or any ways abiding or aiding or abetting therein, shall severely forfeit and pay the sum of $2,000. So basically, in addition to whatever you have on there being forfeited, on your ship being forfeited, you have to pay $2,000 in one part or thereof to the use of the United States, and the other moiety thereof to the use of him or her who shall sue for and prosecute the same. So looking at the first two articles, America or the United States is pretty much putting heavy stipulations or heavy penalties on fitting a ship from the United States' port to deal with slave trade, with basically confiscating everything on your ship and paying a fine of $2,000. So section 3, and be it further enacted that the owner, master, or factor of each and every foreign ship or vessel clearing out for any of the coasts or kingdoms of Africa, or suspected to be intended for the slave trade, and the suspicion being declared to the officer of the customs by any citizen in oath or affirmation, and such information being to the satisfaction of the said officer, shall first give bond with sufficient sureties to the treasurer of the United States, that none of the natives of Africa or any other foreign country or place shall be taken on board the said ship or vessel to be transported or sold as slaves in any other foreign port or place whatever within 9 months thereafter. So long story short, with section 3, it's saying that if you are a foreign ship or vessel, so you weren't a citizen of the United States, but if you were a foreign ship and you were actually going from the United States to any coast or kingdom of Africa, you had to give a bond to the treasurer of the United States that no natives of Africa would be put on your boat for transportation or sold as slaves within 9 months of your leaving. All right, so section 4, which is the last section of this act, and be it further enacted that if any citizen or citizens of the United States shall, contrary to the true intent and meaning of this act, take on board, receive, or transport any such persons as above described in this act for the purpose of selling them as slaves, as foresaid, he or they shall forfeit and pay for each and every person so received on board, transported, or sold as aforesaid the sum of $200 to be recovered in any court of the United States proper and to try the same. The one moiety thereof to the use of the United States, and the other to the use of such persons or persons who shall sue for and prosecute the same. Long story with this one. If you were a citizen of the United States and you did the opposite of what this act was entailing, then you would have to pay $200 for each person that was on board your ship that was, a slave or would be transported as slaves or such. So we can see, kind of starting off with the United States and their Slave Trade Act, is that they're really going after the slave trade. And one of the questions that you may ask, or even when I first read it, I asked, well, why are they, really going after the slave trade? I thought, slavery was such a critical part of the United States and, such an important factor. Why are they kind of limiting it now, especially when the United States just started? All right, guys, I'm going to stop right there with the first one. But with this, I want to look at more slave trade acts that Congress enacted. There are at least 3 more that I know of. One in 1800, another 1803, and another one in 1807. I'm going to leave the link to the Library of Congress's website so that if you want to, you can actually search for and find these acts and look over them if you want. And I'm going to upload another video to talk about more of the slave trade acts and kind of get your mind to kind of wondering, like I said, what direction that they were going when they were prohibiting the slave trade or trying to limit it, especially with America just being newly established. So I'm going to leave it right there until next time.